Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Leicester Gallery. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is our first event that we've had here at Leicester Gallery as part of the exhibition, The Geometry of Language. Geometry of Language has been here for 4.5 months now, but due to the circumstances we are all so familiar with, we haven't been able to open it to the public. So this evening, we're really thrilled to be able to have an opportunity to talk to the curators who worked on the project, who I will hand over to introduce themselves in just a moment. The project is a selection of work from the curators embedded into the context of the collections of language-based practices held at Montfort University. I should say I'm Hugo Worthy. I'm the arts curator here at Leicester Gallery, so I put some of the programming together and have supported Pasha, Kincaid, Emily Grimstead and Laura Holmes and Tim Hardman, who is with us but online, in the development of the project. I was going to hand over to each of you guys, if that was okay, and ask you to tell us a little bit about your practice as individual artists. I should say all of the curators are graduating students, so they have their own fine art practice and have then been closely involved in developing their curatorial skills through this project. So perhaps we can start with Pasha.
Hi, yeah, I'm a third-year fine art student here at Montfort University, and my practice is predominantly autobiographical. I work with identity and intergenerational stories, and more recently I've been looking at racial trauma and how to recount the stories of racial trauma, especially when experienced in childhood. That's me.
Ooh, I feel like there's going to be a little bit of echo and dissonance going on because I utilised drawing as a surrogate, and I use that as a way to locate and externalise internal recounts of my own childhood and infancy. And arguably, you can say that my work's autobiographical too. And this navigation sort of adopts the writings of writer Anne Carson. And there's a really lovely quote that she uses actually, and it's aiming to undo the creatures within us. And my work itself really playfully encompasses this transparent space between fact and fiction. And I want to resolve that as an ideology to depict a child's life as it is lived.
I think both of you, it's an interesting thing about kind of the idea of language as storytelling, as narrative, as a way to kind of unpack biography. And I think you have quite a different relationship to kind of language-based practices, don't you?
It's not autobiographical. I look at time and basically look at kind of time and how you can deconstruct it, where you can sort of deconstruct different languages, and kind of actually use painting to try and create a physical form for time at the moment, and just to kind of reassign boundaries to this word that we kind of created a social construct around.
So three quite different approaches. Perhaps, Tim, you could come in at this point and tell us a little bit about the film that you've produced for us.
Sure, yeah. My practice is primarily lens, mostly with 35mm film. I've been trying to sort of extend the range of that within myself by using the film to produce sculptural elements, and in this case, a digital film that combines lens, appropriated text, and field recorded sound.
Brilliant, thanks ever so much, Tim. That's a really interesting insight into, like, very quick insight into your practices. And building on those, you four have kind of been thrown in at the deep end to pull together an exhibition from the collections that exist here at Montfort University. And perhaps it's worth just saying a little bit about those collections to give some context for the audience. So during the 90s, we had an extraordinary professor who was based in the humanities department here, called Nicolas Zurbrugg. Nick Zurbrugg put together what is one of the leading collections in the United Kingdom of concrete poetry and Fluxus-based work. And so we have an archive of more than 150 objects from key artists across Fluxus, based in New York, so artists like Nick Higgins and Alison Knowles, and concrete poets like Ian Hamilton Finlay and Edwin Morgan. So this kind of resource has been a part of the university over the last 20 years, and I think this is the first time we've really dived into it with students to curate a project around it. So I'm going to ask you guys, between you, perhaps to tell us a little bit about your experiences of kind of curating an existing collection as practicing artists.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really different to anything I've done before. I've had a little bit of a role in kind of curating other exhibitions. I knew what the work was and I knew how to kind of approach it and to make them speak to each other. Whereas this was kind of completely new. I'd never seen most of the work in here before. It was really intriguing to actually have to go through that process of learning about all of the different artists to then kind of have, essentially it was a blank canvas for us as far as I was concerned, to kind of create new links and to create connections between them and then to connect our work with them as well. It was kind of, it was really nice to come in with no kind of preconceived ideas about the work that was in here.
I think also there was this sense of unearthing from the collections, like you go literally going off to a place we don't know of, where the collections are kept, coming across with these like Jasper Johns and Ian Hamilton Finlays and then later on the Bruce Nauman film appearing as if like, and that sense of like that we're in a university that owns some of these works, and we were really, really excited to be showing alongside such kind of, really renowned artists and hearing about how Alison Knowles' suite of prints were made by the head technician here alongside her. So hearing the stories that go along with the collections as well was really exciting. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, in reference to my own work and sort of curatorial decision that we collectively made as a group, the minister one that's just on the wall down there, I feel like that's juxtaposed really aggressively against Ian Hamilton Finlay's Arcadia series, and you've got like this real abject documentation of like such diminutive forms, like transitioning through this period of adolescence, super well, with the chance like superimposing their presence onto the girls and projecting like, well, what I felt was a real orthodox sense of violence, but orthodox in the sense that this like composition defining space that makes up work, well, my work itself, and then the space in relation to the pieces that inform the narrative of the work as well, sort of reflect the modality and how like an environment influences something. Like how Piaget, for example, uses the notion of adaptation, if that makes sense. As the function of survival, that's the one I want to say. Function of survival.
Yeah, I think it's just been like refreshing to have our work in a different context as well as the essential tanks. It completely changes how you look at your.
But we have like different layers going on in the exhibition, because that wasn't even the original layout, and that's what I like with this notion of adaptation. It's like constantly defining and refining what actual sort of visual script is going on a preface, but then the actual notions of meaning that are intertwining beneath that. I thought that was really interesting, and the fact that that was sort of becoming and happening whilst we were doing that, I just thought that really contributes to like how the work's evolving, and the fact that it's had so much time up on the gallery walls as well. It's sort of like imbued, and it feels part of the collection now. So when it first went up on the walls, I don't know if you felt like this, but it felt like our work next to an artist's work, but it feels more of like an integrated, that they've merged, form now.
And I think because of the nature of the subject, the geometry of language, the sense of shape and how we work with shape when we put the pieces in and how we grouped them geometrically, really was really interesting and challenging at the same time. Like, dare we do this with these like incredible artworks? So we've got Ian Hamilton Finley's poetry in a diagonal going down, because we wanted to kind of create these paragraphs of and kind of put our work between those paragraphs. So,
but it challenges that like conventional liminal space that a white gallery wall imposes onto people. And I know Laura, you were drawing out that section in the corner, weren't you? And
Yeah.
it's like, oh yeah, are we entitled to do this? Are we allowed to do this? But I remember having a chat with you, Hugo, and just being like, well, these are decisions that we're making. So yeah, I want to hear more about what you think our curatorial decisions, whether they're successful, if they reflect sort of theme of geometry of language.
So I don't think I need any particular decision to tell you whether they're successful or not. I think you guys know that they are successful. It works, doesn't it,
I
within
was
space?
interested in not like your.
But I think the point that you make that's really interesting is that idea of accreting value over time, that process of having the material here acclimatizes our sense of unity, or builds a sense of unity, so that works which we recognise as somehow different because they're produced by you guys who are living artists working with us on process. Once we've gone through that process of installing the exhibition, they no longer have that discrepancy and they become really integrated into the exhibition. And I think there's something really interesting about the way you guys took and ran with the idea and the value of language as a structure to think through work. Because whilst you all have a relationship to language-based practices, you aren't all reliant on the use of text in the way that concrete poetry certainly is, but actually most of the work here has text quite explicitly within it. And so I think there's something quite exciting, quite interesting about how, I think you touched on this, kind of how it rereads your work, and it challenges your work to...
I like the fact that although as a collection it's all integrated, there's something really autonomous about the piece anyway. The fact that, as Maurice Miller-Conti would say, that self-maintaining systems of expression, each individual piece has its own, what's the word? Has its own, autonomy, background, intention. Yeah, intention, narrative, and I really like the fact that you can look at one piece on its own, but then you can look at that whole wall and read it in a different way.
And I think we talked about this kind of idea of layout, didn't we? So someone like Tillman is a photographer, and the way he thinks through his presentations, moving between different sizes and scales and kind of modes of installing the work. But I think what you guys have produced is something which really becomes about the idea of language as the kind of presiding system for presentations, and this idea of paragraphs or shapes, the idea of the kind of the spread, the book, the layout, rather than it being perhaps a kind of an architectural approach. And it seems to me it's a really interesting way of thinking about curating, is to think through what those framing structures are that we're kind of applying when we bring lots of work together, that you guys, with this, have created an essay that breaks down into paragraphs and work.
Essentially, with the creation of it of concrete poetry, but initially, that was kind of the idea, was to create this thing that could be read in the same way that you read each work individually, or kind of the way you approach it, and kind of to have these paragraphs. We were even sort of thinking about kind of where the full stop would go at the end of it when we were putting it all together. But just to have something that is reflective of the work in the way that we've curated it, almost kind of like you walk in and you kind of, the way that you have to read the ones that are going around the corner is kind of like you physically move up and down. It's kind of like your body language as well really changes. I think body language has become kind of, in my mind recently, become really important to this as well.
I really like that. Go on, sorry, overlapping. You go.
I was just going to say that at least the performance development on the show, because we've got, is it Paul Neagu and Bruce Nauman, and they're just iconic performance pieces, and of course Laura Holmes. And that physicality of navigating the show, like looking down really low and really high pieces, and going into the cube space where you have the video playing, and literally Bruce Nauman is marking out the square there are so many reference points that reference that physicality and movement that we demanded of the audience.
Yeah.
God.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, Laura said something about reading the actual work, but that says to me that the work here requires to be received, and I feel like that notion is so relative to all of our practices as artists anyway, but more so your work in particular, Pasha, because your work is an interactive piece that requires an audience in order for it to be engaged with, else why does the work exist in the first place? Like, you have the notion of compulsion to make, but then the work itself like requires to be interacted with, right? It needs somebody to pick up the block and to be able to read the story and to have that sense of a critical fabulation, to be able to embody the actual narrative that's going on in your work and to be able to have that sense of reflection. And yeah, I remember such a visceral experience of like actually picking up one of your blocks in the gallery space, the fact that we weren't in the studio anymore and everything was just really stripped away. And yeah, I looked at it and I felt that that space for me was the invitation for me to be able to read the work, if that makes sense. Like that was the thing that really imbued with me. And then just going through the blocks, there was like this really like feral nature with the work as well. I was just like, yeah, it just all materialised in my hands, but I thought, yeah, imagine if it just wasn't in space, then it'd just be like really dormant, and I feel that would almost like efface the meaning of your work, but in a nice way, because we were talking about the idea of the palimpsest, weren't we, and the fact that your work is almost an opportunity to efface sort of underwritings and like the negative connotations that come with culture, that come with race and identity and things like that, but yeah, that was my experience with seeing your work.
There's something about what you're saying about the gallery bringing the work to life.
Oh God, yeah, it's
Because of that exposure to, well, the
It's
public that never
really
came in.
interesting moment to have this conversation about whether or not artworks need audiences and what the nature of those audiences is.
They don't need an audience because no one's seen it.
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it, that actually this comes back to, so people have seen it, but it's not been open to the public. It's been a kind of like a really focused, interested cohort who kind of moved through the space and kind of engaged with it. And obviously we'd love for more people to have been able to access it. But there is something really fascinating about that idea of work that kind of exists outside of the kind of the ecology of visibility and how it has value. But for me, I talk about this quite a lot actually, to make an exhibition or a show or an event, running it should be enough on its own terms for it to exist, even without an audience. And I think for all of you, the practice.
Yeah, that's what I know from though, doesn't it? It can stand up by itself, and even about, for example, the artist statement next to it, it says something, it has, I don't know, I do this a lot in my own work, but I play with the idea of abstraction and extraction as a means to play with the idea of a thing that isn't there, as a means for somebody to actually interact and engage with the work. It's the fact that something's missing from it, it requires you to become part of the work in order to complete it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think I'm going to kind of bring us back to this idea of kind of language. It'd be really interesting or useful for me maybe to talk to the relationship of language to your individual practices. And I'm actually going to start with Tim, if that was okay with you, Tim, to tell us a little bit about how you think about your work in terms of language.
So in terms of language, all the words in my piece, from the text used to the title itself, are all appropriated from film, television, and the literature. And in that case, I was particularly using them to kind of demonstrate an individual, perhaps a character, I'd never quite decided on it, who was experiencing life and people at something of a distance. Someone who perhaps reads and watches about things rather than necessarily experiencing them.
Okay, that's great. That's really interesting to kind of see language as kind of, I mean, like conduit, but also a barrier and a way to kind of block. And I'm also really interested in ideas of collage, sort of pirated text, so pre-existing voices that you're kind of utilising and deploying. Laura, perhaps as a painter, you can tell us a bit about the relationship to language.
The relationship to language within my practice is kind of more in the background, I suppose. It's kind of that kind of concept that drives painting rather than being something like many of the works in exhibition actually have physical text on the work. But it's more about kind of recognising that the language that we use is really kind of self-taught in a way. We kind of assign our own boundaries and kind of we assign our own meanings to different things. So it's more of an experimentation of if you take this concept of time and really deconstruct what it means, and taking that as a word and a concept, and like it's just proving that language isn't really as concrete as it seems at first. So once you've kind of broken down something, that you can then reassign this meaning to this new word. So for me now, I've looked at time for like over a year now, and just kind of focusing on this one thing has really kind of reconstructed how I perceive it. So I'm no longer kind of limited by the construct that we have, kind of the quantitative element of time. I'm kind of looking at it more qualitatively, I can never say that word, and looking at more kind of the qualities it has rather than the way we measure it. And it's kind of the journey that I've taken from that beginning point of realising, oh, my work's about time, to kind of where I am now. It's kind of the process of my own deconstruction of the language, really.
Okay, so it's kind of this process of understanding and re-understanding the language, and the way that informs the painting and the
and the way that the painting informs the way that I interpret the language as well. It's kind of very much kind of a two-way system.
But there's also a process of mark making, isn't there? A gesture within your work that could be seen as quite calligraphic.
I suppose so.
You know, like using the body to make marks in space. I think is like a really intrinsic part of your practice, having seen you work in the studio.
Is there a history of kind of early minimalism talked to and was influenced by early Islamic calligraphy, because of the tightness around it, without necessarily understanding how the calligraphy was read, but just the physical form of the words? So something really interesting about that, what you said.
Yeah.
Yours isn't minimal.
You look at the physical form, so the counters and anti-vessels, but the physical form is there, but it requires to be filled, but it acts like a bit of vehicle in a way, in that sense, to be able to like use the audience that would see, or use the first order to the word to be able to like navigate the word, if that makes sense. But on the preface, the majority of the works in the exhibition actually have text with them. But yeah, I like the fact that yours abstracts that idea of text, and going back to what you're saying before about this two-way thing, I actually wrote a little bit something about your work, and I thought that it was the process of shaping and cognizing the awareness of understanding and the understanding of the awareness, and that concept is integral to you because it is that echo that happens between the two. Not like a resonator concept, it doesn't get lost, but it's like a way to constitute and reconstitute perception all the time. And then with the different layers, I again think back to you in the studio of one day you've done like 3 or 4 different marks, next day you come in and do like another cluster of marks, and then those layers sort of begin to build up and then form in a holistic sense, like the actual finishing. Oh, sorry.
The idea is that each of my works is like a new measurement of time, like a new unit of time. So I can look back on my practice and think, oh, I did that then, and kind of each painting, I can remember kind of things that happened around it just from what I've been doing within the painting. Kind of that layering is really kind of a way that I've been able to access my own memory in a way. It's been such a strange experience, but there is something deeply personal about it as well.
But then that really upholds Tolkien's ideas of the attic, and like labyrinths and things like that. He has a really lovely quote in his book, The Tree and the Leaf, and it's actually just epitomises how things are required to be found, and these things are collected and stored, and then which you come across them, you almost have like a quite cathartic epiphany style of relativity that comes with actually finding the thing, like a memory, like being able to retrieve something or locating something. And I feel like that process, whether artists like it or not, is really enabling us to be able to locate something, or just that theory of relativity that happens between one thing and another, whether it be subject to object or subject to subject. It's just happening. Yeah.
Quite like that idea of the idea of, I think the artist is the finder.
Well, of course they are.
Yeah. And the actor.
Anyway.
I'm going to come to you in a second, but Emily, Pasha, you explicitly use text in your work. So can you tell us a little bit how it gets deployed? I think it's really interesting, quite different.
Well, the piece I have in here is a piece that was in response to a whole body of kind of family discussion about experiences of racism in childhood. And I actually kind of collated everything that my children said that they'd experienced between the age of 3 and 18, and wrote these kind of on Excel spreadsheets, everything, when it happened and how old they were, as kind of documentation. And it was very kind of archival in its approach, and then decided to engrave these onto 60 wooden blocks and ask audience members to read those. And whereas you look at concrete poetry and it's kind of about play on words and shape sculpting, although it's two-dimensionally, but sculpting words in space and how they interplay and relate to each other. My work is like really literal and really narrative, and is like verbatim memories. So it's very different, but the audience can pick up those phrases and play with them in space and look at shapes and relativity as they build constructions with bricks and deconstruct them. So there is a relationship, I think, with the work that's in the gallery in that respect, but it's very different. And I like to think that I just like to say it as it is. And the whole purpose of what I'm doing is to permeate through denial about racism, so to actually give facts of things that literally happened, whether they're microaggressions or really overt traumatic experiences of racism, alongside some really innocent memories of like things like we built sandcastles or we went to Bluebell Woods, or so I've kind of juxtaposed really traumatic things like, I don't know, they said my hair looked like I'd been electrocuted because I had an afro, or I don't know, more innocent things like the teacher always used to pat my hair, but people can pick them up and hopefully register and resonate with the inhumane aspect of those phrases. I don't know, am I making sense?
It's making sense. I think something really interesting about this idea of like transparency. So what you're looking for is this kind of like entirely transparent language which communicates as directly as possible, which can never 100% be achieved. There's always this kind of like interpretive structure that sits around it. The way we kind of write the fonts will create that it's read. It's really interesting because it's engraved on blocks. But you also have print works.
Yes.
Which do so, again something slightly different because you have the illustrations from they talk to histories of book production.
Yes.
And the idea of memory in that, which is really important there.
And I think it's really important that it's kind of that intergenerational recording of human stories that are really important to me. And obviously I use the word verbatim, but nothing can be verbatim if it's based on memory. It's always like going to be distorted or tinted by our own perceptions of what we experienced. But I've tried to remain true to what was recounted to me to keep that kind of integrity of what was experienced. But yeah, and it is different when you use text two-dimensionally to using it on a three-dimensional surface. Completely different. And I use Comic Sans, which is like a big no-no font rate. I mean, I spoke to various people about it. They were like, you cannot use Comic Sans because it's that classic school typeface that many designers would just completely slate. But I wanted to have that kind of, most of this happened in school, or I wanted to have that A without the, whatever it's called, and the sans serif text, so that it was just readable. Just, you could not read this. It's so easy to take in and absorb. I've made them much bigger now. I've made them 5 foot tall, and they're readable from 2 meters away, which is something that I learned from the gallery here, that you can just walk past them. And I don't want people to be able to just walk past them and ignore them. I want them more present and not ignorable.
That's really interesting to think about it in terms of scale, isn't it? That actually, it's funny how much things change by getting bigger and smaller and the way we relate to them. And actually, everything in here is of a sort of scale of a book that actually.
Well, I feel like we're challenging the conventional idea of a storybook, because all of these pieces that I found, because I know that I use no frames in my work, and I purposefully chose to show the deckled edge on paper because that constitutes like this feeling of freedom and liberty within my work. But yeah, although yes, in holistic terms it is a collection, I feel like there are, in reductive terms, all these individual components which make up an actual functioning thing. But then throwing it back to your work, and thought that's just like interrupting my train of thought. I really like the way your work oscillates between fact and fiction, but then that oscillation becomes another tale within itself. Because I read some of the statements in your work and think, or rather question, I can't believe that's actually happened, but to know that that's come from a primacy of experience, you, family members, childhood, and things like that, it raises more questions, which then makes me want to actively observe the work more. We should talk about this idea of scale. And I had it in my head thinking, well, if people can't see like the actual words on the work, then perhaps that would be an element of engagement for people to want to pick up the words. But then I thought, if you can see them, maybe that adds an element of passivity. So people can actually read the work walking by, but they don't require to come into the gallery to see it. So it's like that balance of.
This is why I've made a film. Because I want to model that interaction, because what's interesting about this piece is people can walk on by it, completely ignore it. They can pick up one brick and go, oh, that's a bit too much for me to take in, and put it down. Or they can literally get really into it and read it and discuss it and contemplate what it says. And I've kind of done a film now which then models how people can interact it, and it's like children and adults interacting with it. So I'm experimenting because participation is new to me, because I've been a 2-dimensional printmaker. So the idea of making something that's more 3-dimensional, that's more kind of seen in the round, and begs the audience to participate. And what I'm realizing is with that, there's a lot of experimentation to see what works, what doesn't work. How does the audience interact with that piece? And I think it's different to working 2-dimensionally, because there's kind of like a given language that some people stand so many meters away from the piece, look at the piece, maybe go up close to it, maybe come back, but there's just this parallel space.
You're like challenging that demarcation between the locality of the subject and the remoteness of the subject. I know Edwin Card looks at a lot of that in his work too, but I have had a long history with you in the print room, and that conversation that happens around how something will be received, but then obviously you can't control that when it comes into an environment where, like you say, that participation is absolutely demanded. And I remember you saying that, oh, what if this happens, what if that happens? But you're trying to almost find like a way to harness the nature of the arbitrary, but not so in a way where it's like completely controlled and things like that. So you're
so to what extent do you dictate? I want you to do this, I want you to do it now. Or like, whatever. And is that you can't do something that's
2-dimensional processes are arguably a lot more controlled. I have to agree there.
I'll take that.
Bringing us cleverly to your work, Emily, which is two-dimensional and quite controlled.
Oh, gosh, yes.
And I think it's interesting because it refers to children's illustration, and I think so it fits very comfortably, but it doesn't explicitly use language. But one of the things that's recognisable about language is ideas of pattern, and pattern seems very important. So can you talk a little bit kind of to how you think of language as a way to think about your work?
Yeah, so repetition actually resolves quite a predominant motif within my work. It's very playful protagonist. And I was really inspired by the works of Otto Rank actually, and his theory of the double, and also Robert Rogers' work of the self and other. So there's this constant sort of dictation between consciousness and unconsciousness that's happening. And I was also influenced by the idea of fractals as well, the fact that there are patterns within patterns that happen within the work. And I like to utilise the vacancy of space as well and the occupancy of that. So the way in which I will compose the works on the page is determined around the peripheries of the paper, because that determines the sort of, I don't know, whether I want to use like a huge piece of paper and put like a, for example, like a postage stamp size piece of work on the page. You know, most people look at it and be like, what a waste of paper, but then that sort of brings the questions to why such a diminutive form is put on a piece of paper, why is it that small? It's like being put under a spotlight, and like you said earlier, that idea of the archive, it's a ruin, it's something to be found. And yeah, I like the fact that distilled within the works is this idea of tyranny and trauma as well that's happened to the children. And I know that, okay, from an autobiographical point of view, that comes from myself, but having worked on this for, I don't know, say about 2 and a bit years now, I've managed to find this sort of midpoint whereby I can detach myself from the work so it doesn't feel personal. I feel confident to be able to put my work out into the domain for someone else to like navigate with the work and use that contingent term, because then that, I would say, arguably contributes more to the evolution of my work. And that within itself is a language that, yeah.
It's almost like a translation.
Yeah,
translating your experience by making it less kind of more passive to then make it more kind of readable for the viewer.
That's so true. And I've always figured that my work is a way to re-experience trauma without like primarily re-experiencing it in the flesh. Like you could say that about your work as well. And
yeah, I love the way you play with scale. Yeah. And that's, you know, just to describe the Last Supper, which is a row of tiny little girls sitting eating their bowl of soup, and it's like a regimented line. And I know, because we've been in the print room together, that it is the same girl repeated right along. And that play with the space where you have this enormous amount of paper, which is this lovely rosy creamy colour with a torn edge, above the little line of girls. And the fact that you titles seem really important in your work, that you've named it Last Supper.
yeah.
And that play on, there's been so many different versions of the Last Supper that kind of through time, through modern art. That, but this, I just love that approach to scale and that repetition that you do. And it's so endearing to see these little girls on the page, and it begs so many questions about what are they doing, why are they there, who's looking after them. The narrative, there's this backstory in every one of your prints that gets this kind of inquisitive kind of participation from your audience.
Yeah.
There's like a real narrative as well between the way that the girls interact with the negative space as well. Kind of there is that narrative there, and there's kind of this story and this language between the positive and negative space and kind of what's happening, how they're speaking to each other. That's really kind of to use language as well.
No, I'll never forget a word that you told me. It's precarious, and every time it comes to me, I'm like, I always think of you. But anyway, there is such a precarious nature to these girls, because they're neither dead or alive, if that makes sense. They are just living in the space between, and that's what I value so much as the artist. I don't subscribe to this idea of polarities with one or the other. It is the space in between that my work lives within, and I've always looked at that in relation to the arts calendar as well. I've always thought, where does my work actually belong on this lineage? And I like the fact that at the moment it doesn't really belong anywhere. I mean, arguably you could say, oh, it's extremely representational, or it belongs to this, or do you not think you're more of an illustrator? But I like the fact that, yeah, it doesn't belong anywhere at the moment. It is just floating. It is just floating. But all of my works, you could say, are arguably floating. It's this sense of space that you can't capture, but it materialises just so beautifully on the page. Yeah.
Yeah, I second that, definitely.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's an amazingly useful insight, kind of quite different relationships to language that kind of underpin your work. So I'm now going to ask about whether or not it's useful to think about the way you put this exhibition together and the way you think about exhibitions as a form of language or a model of language. And we talked a little bit about this already in terms of kind of the way it's been structured. But I think that idea of how objects take on meanings in relationship to one another and how that inflects the way we read them. And I think there's something interesting about the term reading, isn't there? That actually, when we're talking about language, we use the term read to describe our relationship with artworks and exhibitions quite a lot. And is that an appropriate term?
I've always kind of, I think you just noticed that every time we've been speaking about this exhibition, we've like talked about how we read it rather than how we look at it or kind of view it. And I've always kind of, I've taken that as a kind of an assumption that we read the exhibition like we would read like a book or a diary or something. And kind of what's really kind of in terms of the way that you see the exhibition for me, kind of, it's about those things that you don't necessarily read the first time, or you don't necessarily spot, especially with your work, Pasha, as well. And some of the work on the walls behind it is kind of, I've been in here so many times now to come and kind of have a look at the exhibition, and there is always a new way that I read the exhibition like that. And even today, I saw a block of yours that I've not seen before. And I was like, how have I not seen all of them already? I've played them so many times. But kind of that, it's kind of an ever-changing narrative of the exhibition as well. Kind of, you can see something different every time. And I really like that idea of kind of this progression of understanding and kind of, as you, the more times you read it, the more times you understand it, I suppose.
I think I'm just thinking that there's this line that we all think we're going to take. We're going to be in our studios, we're going to make this work, and then we're going to put it in a gallery and we're going to show it.
We meaning artists.
We meaning artists. Yes.
Yes.
What else are we? What else is there?
Who knows?
So but that's, and it's such a luxury to put something in a gallery and to ask that an audience comes to witness what you've been creating. But I'm really interested at the moment in kind of more social engagement, so taking that art outside beyond the gallery and asking people to participate from where they're at in their lives. So I'm interested if that's kind of like a next step in terms of participation for me.
Like making it happening. Bit of Alan Sorry,
Yeah.
I did that, guys. So much.
Well, what's coming up for me is about dialogues and the piece that I've made and then the video around that. Now I'm looking at how to engage people in content. But it's just that kind of like, I don't know, because the word exhibit means to show, doesn't it? And it's kind of, it's a bit assumptive, if that's such a word, that presumptive that you, yeah, thank you, that you make it and then you show it, and then people see it, and it's kind of this.
I think it's really interesting. We've had quite a few conversations in the studio about kind of deconstructing this idea of what an exhibition is, kind of what actually its purpose is, because there are a lot of practices now where the more kind of traditional style exhibition just is not working, and kind of for yours and kind of my work to become. It's going to become kind of more participatory, a kind of more interactive installation, and actually kind of in many ways the traditional ways in which kind of you assume that people will come into a room, they'll look at the things, they're just not relevant anymore.
But it's like the way that we've done this exhibition, if it's going to be the future of exhibitions, the fact that the work is up displayed, nobody can actually see it. It's also almost in a sense of privacy with that, and like challenging the idea of privacy, the fact that it's exposed on display, but you can't look at it, touch it, heighten that even more so with the fact that you must remain at least 1 metre or 2 metres away from the work. That idea of engagement is being cut off, but is sort of slowly materialising in the sense that there are platforms that work can be viewed on, the fact that there can be archives that are made digitally and sort of put out into the domain, but then is that experience that we're trying to grasp as artists firsthand being diminished in that way?
The word that comes up for me is death. It's like,
Laura, you does that one, don't you?
it's been entombed, and the works were sort of entombed, and then they were put out of their tombs and put to life in the gallery. But the gallery is laid dormant for 4.5 months, and it's kind of like, are we in this? You know, we've seen these digital exhibitions online, which are just not the same work.
I'm so
physically present. But we're in this really evolutionary point, aren't we?
I think we're going to see huge changes when we think about and related to gallery space. I think one of your points about engagement and activity, which offers other ways in, is at the heart of the way people see these institutions working. I think in the way they're funded, in the way we talk about their impact, more and more they're driven by what we recognise as kind of civic agendas. So they're there to help and support. So without having necessarily pinned down what that looks like, I think this really interesting thing's happening. You were talking about this idea of kind of entombment and death. The idea of what's really interesting about a space like this, all spaces actually, I think, where there have been exhibitions over the last 4 or 5 months where there's been really no access, is that there hasn't been no access. There's been very limited, very exclusive access for a small group of people who've had whatever professional reasons to be in that world. So you guys have had access to the exhibition with the duration of it.
Or even like security guards or cleaners, people that have to be maintaining that space. I think that's really interesting.
But this is across the board. If you think about like the National Gallery that no one who doesn't work there has been into for 6 months, actually there is a cohort who have had access to it. But what it reminds me of is a return to the history of the private gallery. So that kind of post-Renaissance moment where you had collections of artworks which are displayed for your friends and to impress them with your good taste, but there's no member of the public who can access them. And then there's another history museum that sits alongside that. But that idea of the kind of private space is really important, and how we kind of, that's not going to stop existing, and the commercial sector is kind of driven by some of that. But there is something really interesting about it's kind of like these ghost shows that take place. And they'll go into the stuff of legend. You guys have done a great show here. It's a really lovely show, and I wish more people had seen it. And I will remember it. It will kind of live in our worlds, in our memories, and a few other people. I think it's really large-scale shows. I'm really interested in Nottingham Contemporary, a Grace Jones show, which was only open for two weeks or so. So you end up with this kind of like a tiny group of people. It's like seeing the first Sex Pistols shows in like the 70s or something. They'll become really iconic moments because of the limited access.
And there's like the Phoebe Boswell show that was going on at the New Art Exchange. Yeah. It was going to happen. It was announced. Pictures were shown of it, and there was this kind of like appetites, you know, all warmed up for us. And then of course it's not happened. Yeah. And you know, you get these little updates on her Instagram, and then you've got Tracy Emin and the response to Edwin Monk, and that show that's been really beautifully digitalized and shown online. But there's still a deadness to it, and we're all behind screens interfacing with this artwork, and it's incredibly sad, and there's a sense of loss, and there's a sense of what's the future? Is it going to change? And this is a living moment, 4.5 months of dormant exhibition.
Yeah.
But where is it amazed me? I was reading a book, well, sort of like a collection of essays in one regarding the design of ecologies in relation to architectural contexts, etc. And there's a really lovely essay in there by Peter Hassel who talks about this idea of Neumann the entity in relation to architecture and sort of like dormant vacant spaces, and just again like echoing the idea that you just said in regards to the actual deadness and vacantness of a space that requires to be occupied, but that lack of occupation is like, where is that occupation going? What's the value of the occupation now in a space? That's what I would like to question for the future of galleries anyway. But yeah,
I suppose it's interesting how we've almost qualified the works that are in here as well, kind of, in terms of how they speak to each other. We've used that phrase quite often.
yeah.
And actually kind of the works themselves then replace the viewers that haven't really kind of been able to come in. Kind of the relationship between each other, how does that replace kind of me looking at a work?
Yeah, it's like questioning that idea of relativism, because in my mind, relativism exists between primarily in the gallery space, subject and object. Then it's like you've got this weird relationship of object going on, but then does that then therefore make it a subject? Like, tell me. Tell me.
I don't think that does.
I trust there is in the future.
I think something really interesting about that idea of kind of like works replacing audiences. We did a project with a woman called Annika Strom, and we had 6 of her performances running concurrently in the gallery. And each performance is a kind of group of people who have a set of instructions that they have to follow. So one is 10 Paris men, and one is 7 women in the way. They're really amazing pieces, they're great. But what was interesting about them is they start to interact. They become like kind of autonomous gestures which actually start literally talking to each other. So there's kind of one of them's called 5 Lovely People. So the 5 Lovely People talk to the 10 embarrassed men and try and make them less embarrassed. It's a really interesting dynamic where kind of works, and because it's performative, it does something slightly different. But actually, there is this idea of kind of an almost consciousness which the work starts to take on, a responsibility that the work starts to take on. And there's another project we did with a guy called Matthias Sperling, who's a dancer. Absolutely was embedded in this idea of kind of works bearing witness, and he was talking to kind of works in the German Expressionist collection and about their history through Germany in the 20th and 30s and the Holocaust. And actually something really significant about that idea that works accrue and accrete memory over time. And if we think about the way a lot of the market works, it's kind of rooted in that, isn't it? Provenance, that idea of kind of where works have been, what they do, what they've done, what they've seen, is actually really important to the way we think about it.
And also what's interesting about this is we've done a current day response to works that were made decades ago. And like what you're talking about, German Expressionism is like, again, that sense of unearthing and bringing forward and seeking meaning now in response to what was made then. And that comes back to
I'm really interested in like a post-historical viewpoint. So kind of I've been looking at there's a performance artist, Ira, and he's done this whole performance looking at the Jewish library and kind of the relationship between the two and how kind of his work kind of pulls out these new stories about the Jewish library, but then actually kind of way that you can then reinterpret them in this modern day context. I'm really interested in taking work and putting it in a different context to the one it was made. I think that's partly what we've done here as well. Kind of in my mind, especially, I don't know about you, but
I feel like with that last point you said, there's like this materialised science behind art that people don't talk about, and the fact that with art you have that homage and being able to pick up and take apart the things that you want from, whether it be context or psychology, philosophy, or whatever context is the predication of that context of your basis of your work. I feel like we have this almost power. It's not godlike, but you have a means of coupling and synthesis to be able to make your own anthropological or anthropomorphic fact as an artist, to instill that within your work. And to me, there's something that happens in art that's quite, well, I think Ferdinand Saussure says it like a semiological science, like the science of the sign. And I think that is a happening within artworks that you would not be able to explain by the premises of fact in science, because it's entirely empirical.
So I really like this interpretation of kind of art practice as like a manufacturing of facts, because it's so counterintuitive to the way we think about creative practice of any kind, is that it's not facts. And actually something really powerful about ideas. But that is what is happening. And I think kind of within your practices that actually there is a very direct relationship to what we think of as the fact. Memory is history, is kind of like bear witness. Through something which is kind of about finding ways into new understandings of facts and ideas in that time. Do you know John Latham's stuff? Sort of black time home and black time structures. John Latham's awesome and does lots of really good things. But he does interesting stuff around time. I'm going to suggest that maybe I was going to ask see if there are any questions. If there aren't, should we head in about 5 minutes towards watching the film?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
because it was bang on 6 o'clock now.
Yeah.
So I don't know if anyone has any questions. Oh. So if anyone has any questions, if they want to type them into the chat, that would be fantastic. Otherwise, we will bring up and watch Pasha's film.
Watching the world go by.
I don't think we have any questions. I'm going to go across to share the film. I'm going to hand across. Should we say goodbye at this point and leave the film running? Yes?
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for joining us this evening for the conversation. I'm going to move across so you can see the rest of the panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Right, now let me do the screen sharing and get the film up.
Oh, we get things to say about it.
You might want to just say that there's no sound in the film so that people don't think.
There is no sound in the film, so just going to go and check that it is, in fact, sharing.
Tim, is it sharing?
Yes, it is.